All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're just going to have another minute until we get everyone into the meeting room, and then we'll start kicking off.
Yeah. All right, looks like numbers are starting to climb, Mark, so we might get going. Morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to this Ask the Expert webinar. Today, we're discussing all things project prioritization, the what, the why, and the how. So before Mark kicks us off, if you've been a part of a few of these webinars by now, that you know that they're quite engaging discussions. So please, if you do have any questions or comments that you'd like to put through, please either use the raise your hand feature or just simply type into the chat, which we'll also be monitoring throughout. So I'll now pass on to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Söster, and I have the pleasure of leading you through Project Prioritization Ask an Expert session today. A super interesting subject for quite a lot of organizations. And I thought we'll take some time to think about why we want to do project prioritization, for what organization it is, what do we need to consider when it comes to project prioritization from an organizational point of view. And then I also wanted to ensure that we show you a couple of demos based on feedback that we got. Thank you for those people who have submitted questions before. Just outlining a couple of examples on how project prioritization is done from an industry standards point of view. Again, super interesting time right now. The project and portfolio management industry is literally evolving and has been evolving over the last couple of years with additional modeling and additional processes like Agile, like SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, Lean. And I wanted to outline what that actually also means in the context of an organization. So let's get going. Please don't be shy. If you have any questions, I have no problems if you butt in. This is an engaging session. Usually we would do them face-to-face, and well, the new normal is virtual face-to-face. So please don't be shy and ask any kind of questions or experience that you may have. You will find that throughout the session. I will also outline that. So we have quite a lot of content to go through. Alice already mentioned it, the who, why, how, what, when it comes to project prioritization. And please share your experience, your concerns, or your positive or negative experience, or also ideas that you may have when it comes to project prioritization. And then at the end, I want to outline just a couple of examples, especially when we're talking about project prioritization in the context of benefit realization, which I always refer to as the glue between strategy and execution. And then I will also go through a industry standard that's called pairwise comparison, and then I'll open up for Q&As. Okay, let's get going. Now, project management and project prioritization for me are always two separate things. Project prioritization, as a lot of organizations tend to say, is doing the right work, ensuring that I approve the type of initiatives or the type of work that maximize my organizational value, and of course also accomplish my strategic goals. Whereby in the project management area, it really is about doing the work right, ensuring that the approved work is actually then managed in a consistent fashion. So that's always that balance. Now, the reason why this is super important, I have lots of birds that want to participate, as you can see. Let me just close the door, sorry. All right, I'm back, sorry. And of course, project management and project prioritization need to go hand in hand, because the information that we capture as part Okay, my dog is there as well. The information that we capture as part of managing projects or even project proposals and business cases, we need to ensure that we have the right information in order to make an objective decision of what kind of prioritization or what kind of projects do I actually approve. So let's step a step back and think about, okay, how are we actually doing this today? Well, the big word here is really gut feel. Not that I have a problem with gut feel. I think a lot of people in a lot of organizations actually do that purely because of the nature of the project. When we look at a particular project, we know that we need to execute that because it is vital. Do we need to prioritize that at times? Well, there are quite a lot of organizations that say, no, look, I know that this is an important project, so therefore I execute that. So is that appropriate? Well, it is definitely appropriate for quite a few organizations. However, larger and complex organizations in particular need to have a little bit more of a scientific approach or a little bit more of a consistent approach when it comes to project prioritization. So, well, what kind of, or who, sorry, so who is actually, or what kind of industry is actually using project prioritization? And really, I'm just going to outline a couple of sort of snap words. We always consider the industry, and I'll give you an example. Service-related industries, organizations like Sensei, for example, well, we execute projects to provide high value to our customers. So therefore, when a customer engages us, well, we don't have to go through a prioritization process to determine whether we actually are going to execute that project. So a lot of customer-facing organizations really don't need that kind of prioritization incentive unless they do, of course, also internal projects. And for us, internal projects is really product development and what kind of new features are we going to implement. And again, I'll outline that how we do this a little bit later as well. So I refer to them as non-revenue facing organizations. I'm not sure whether that's the right term, but I hope I get the message across. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to ensure that organizations that have a list of initiatives, business cases or ideas optimize their investment against really strategic goals. So predicting a strategic outcome based on the initiatives. I always like to say that strategy is really planning the strategy, whereby execution means execution of initiatives. Initiatives for me are really projects, programs or portfolios that we then execute in order to accomplish that. That being said, we do actually have quite a lot of organizations and industries that are required to do that type of project prioritization because they are dependent on funds within the government or funds from the government, utility organizations, water, electricity. They actually need to outline a 5-year plan, a 5-year reset plan, where they submit proposals and budgets behind their initiatives. So really maximizing the in-house assets, ensuring that we get the right funds from government, are generally organizations that need to prioritize those projects. Bucky, my dog is very entertaining. I'm sorry about that. Maria, can you please take Bucky out? So sorry, let's just continue. So from here, the industries that are there, thank you. Then of course the purpose behind it, as I already outlined that before. Why are we doing this? Well, we want to make sure that we provide the highest value, the highest possible and optimized value to the organization. So that starts with things like constraints, resource constraints. Well, I only have a certain amount of resources and I need to ensure that I provide them with the right high value amount of work. cost optimization to ensure that we don't double up on some projects, and look, especially large organizations where project ideas and business cases come through different departments. You will find that quite often business cases and ideas double up in different departments. So we want to ensure that we don't double up on that kind of work as well, of course. We also want to ultimately achieve our strategic goals, or business drivers, as some organizations refer to that, so that we understand what kind of projects we want to optimize. Now, it's interesting, especially in today's time, in the COVID time, many organizations actually start to really reflect in the type of initiatives that they want to execute, and therefore need to have a process, a methodology, and quite often also a tool to ensure that they actually optimize their workload, especially based on that current COVID situation. So where situations really change quite dramatically or change often, that's where that project prioritization comes into place. Now, the reason why this is so important is because the information behind it that we actually measure needs to be maintained, and therefore we need to understand the effort that it takes to do that versus the benefit that the organization ultimately achieves through the project prioritization. Now, before I continue, are there any kind of questions that you have in regards to what kind of organizations may do that? And I may have forgotten some that are here on the call. So please feel free to let us know whether you actually do project prioritization, in what kind of industry it is, and why you do that kind of project prioritization. All right, don't be shy. Well, let us continue, and hopefully you get an idea of how you can actually implement those kinds of project prioritizations as well. So after we determined who actually needs to do project prioritization and why we need to do project prioritization, well, I always simplify that, and ultimately I want to ensure that I optimize the work against my strategic goals, and that's super important. Now, how are we going to accomplish that is then the next part, of course, there are industry standard models that allow you to introduce a consistent and actually also reasonably trustworthy way forward, as long as you have the ability to ensure that the data that you collect is actually trustworthy. And look, I just wanted to visualize a couple of those standards, and depending on the organization and depending on the organizational maturity itself, we quite often then see different types of prioritization. And again, I want to make that clear only because there are industry standards out there, like the pairwise comparison, like scaled agile framework. Organizations themselves need to determine how they prioritize that. And quite often there are very simple terms that we have. I'll dive a little bit deeper into three of them. One of them is just a simple one. One of them is the scaled agile framework, and one of them is the pairwise comparison when it comes to that kind of project prioritization. All right, let's have a look. So this is now the interesting part, because in order for us to prioritize projects, we really need to understand what kind of information do I need in order to be confident that I can actually create a prioritization concept, and also know that that prioritization is accurate. And as you can see, there are certain types of information sets that I need to have depending on the model that I do. Well, you may only have a project request or a business case that that outlines a very simple form of, hey, I think this is a high priority project or medium or low priority project, but the justification behind that opinion is actually the important part, especially for roles that need to ultimately approve that. So for us, it really is, how long does a particular project take? What kind of resources do I need? And for what kind of time do I need them? Especially within a project, there are certain types of resources that you may only need at the start. Some of them you may only need at the end. And in order to determine the constraints that we have within the organization, we need to understand those kinds of resources. I'm not suggesting that you need to have an entire work breakdown structure with every single task assigned to it. Often in the business case, that's not the case. However, an indication of the amount of time and effort is, of course, super important. And then we need to think about dependencies, especially when we do project prioritization through a industry standard model like the pairwise comparison, where we actually have the ability to determine whether a project is of high priority or of low priority. However, at the same time, we need to determine that certain low priority projects that under normal circumstances wouldn't be selected actually need to be selected, because more high level or high value projects are actually reliant on those other projects in order to, stand up a server, for example, or provide a certain foundation for an ongoing project. So these kinds of dependencies are super important. Of course, the investment requirements, which is the financial component, how much financial assets do I need in order to execute a project, and what is that return on investment ultimately of that project. Anticipated deliverables, of course. I need to understand what kind of project delivers what kind of value. And then also the alignment of those strategic goals. And again, throughout the demonstration, I will show you how you can actually align to that. There are organizations that are very risk adverse, in particular government organizations that really want to ensure that there is a risk profile behind a project, so that that their constituents, for example, like to have that project executed and don't see a risk behind it. Sorry, there was an open question.
Oh, hi, Mark. It's Caroline. Yeah.
Hi, Caroline.
I'm just looking at the what you've got here as things that you need to be considering. Is there any, obviously depending on the project, is there any ones that you would say are the have-to things that you need to consider when you're looking at project information for prioritisation, or is it a case-by-case basis, or is there like a core essentially?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I believe that any kind of initiatives that needs to fall under a prioritization model, and I'm not suggesting that every single project does that, by the way, but every project that falls under this prioritization model definitely needs to have certain sets of information. Now, in my personal opinion, the reason why we execute projects is to accomplish our strategy. So in my world, it really is the association to business strategy and to what impact this this project influence that business strategy. So it could be as easy as having your 6 or 7 strategic goals and measuring them against that. And you will find in the demonstration I outlined that based on this model. That being said, you will also find, Caroline, that a lot of projects are just, business as usual projects where I know I just don't need to prioritize them. So the initial prioritization of, is this an initiative that accommodates for a strategy in comparison to, hey, I need to keep my lights on, so therefore I need to have that project. Well, and then lastly, project types like that have constraints that may not have a high strategic strategic value, but need to be implemented either way. So, for example, legislative changes, government rules that change. Well, we don't have a choice to do that. So that forcing in and forcing out is one of those key components that that a solution, a digital solution, may not be able to do for you, where common sense and knowledge just are a necessity, really. So the reason why I say that what project information is really ultimately determines the effort that it takes in order to build up a business case, in comparison to, of course, the benefit that you get out of those kinds of information sets. On one hand, we need to make sure that they are consistent, that they are trustworthy, and on the other hand, we need to ensure that that information is then always used, so that we don't double handle that we don't suddenly come up with different prioritization constraints or different strategic goals that we haven't communicated there. So the what project information really determines the amount of effort that it takes in order to build up a business case. And every organization is slightly different. Some organizations are quite happy with just simply a scope statement. Other organizations really require a measurement behind it, whether this is high, medium, or low. When we want to do a consistent project prioritization component, we need to ensure that we understand it needs to be against values that are measurable. So if you say, well, I do this project because I feel like it, well, I feel like it may not be a measurable component, and therefore we need to understand that prioritization happens against goals that we want to accomplish that are measurable, and therefore the initiatives that contribute to accomplishing that goals need to have a subset of those kinds of measurements. All right, now after we determined, okay, who needs to do the project prioritization and how are we going to do that and what kind of information do we have, I would like to now drill a little bit deeper into models. There were a lot of questions and predetermined questions of, well, what kind of models are out there? And interestingly enough, being an accountant by trade, coming from Germany, I know that a process is super important, and it doesn't matter with what kind of other accountant I talk. A profit and loss is a profit and loss, and a balance sheet is a balance sheet. So therefore, the communication between those processes, no matter what kind of industries are, accountants can talk to each other because of that combined because of that combined communication and process. Now, in the project management area, well, as we know, there's not just one project management process. There are many of them, not to mention the in-house methodologies that are in here. Well, I think with project prioritization, that's very similar. There are some models that are proven models, especially for large organizations that go through that notion. However, especially in today's world, we are starting to see a lot of organizations focus towards agility. In particular, during the COVID time, we can see that organizations need to quickly adapt to new changes. So how does that play in when it comes to project prioritization? How often are we actually doing project prioritization? And if I prioritize my projects, do I incorporate existing projects that are already on the way? So all of these kinds of questions are often process-related questions and also process industry-related questions. So I'll give you an example. Utility organizations, when they prioritize their projects, they prioritize the projects against, again, the reset period, that 5-year reset period, and therefore may only do that type of prioritization maybe annually, and maybe then do a little bit more focus after those 5 years. Whereby financial services organizations that need to quickly adopt to new market, I have seen a project prioritization happens on a quarterly basis, where they really need to redefine the priorities based on a changing market. In particular, in the last 12 months, we've seen that quite a lot. So, what is the right model for me? Well, if you consider your own organization and you look inside your organization, you really should firstly focus on the maturity of the organization. Am I doing project prioritization already? And if so, how am I going to do that? Does every department, do they do that differently? Look, especially for larger organizations where each individual department needs to come up with a collection of projects once a year, needs to submit those projects. You know, how do they actually come up with that list? And I'm sure that some departments do that differently. IT departments, for example, would do that probably completely different to, let's say, a construction department or even a HR department or marketing. So ensure that there is the right model for that right type of work that allows you then to consolidate all of these project lists. And then from an organizational perspective, you need to have that consistent approach. So prioritization models for us really depend on the type of organizations and the type of projects that you execute. Are you executing waterfall projects, meaning, you know, along design and planning phase and then an execution and closing phase? Or are you more in an agile world where it really is more about feature sets, products, reacting to customer feedback, and how quickly do I actually trigger this information down to all the way to organizations that said, look, based on gut feel or based on high level information, I just simply want to have a high, medium or low classification so that everyone understands that. As long as we understand what high, medium and low means, and in our experience, that has always been one of those trigger points. So when you consider what model is right for me, ensure that you know what kind of industry you're working in. Make sure that you understand how much effort versus benefit is outlined there, and ensure that you communicate that kind of models to all of those levels. Sorry, there is a question.
Yes, hi, Mark. Ilya here.
Hi, Ilya.
Just a quick question. I have seen on some organisations go through that refining and optimisation of their prioritisation model just to get a specific outcome because the original prioritisation list didn't give them what they wanted. How do you actually stop organisations from doing that, especially when they've got pet projects that they want to push through?
That's a very good question, because project prioritization, unfortunately, is not always based on objectivity. And you're quite right, Ilya. There are projects where we refer to them as pet projects that are needing to be pushed through. I generally don't have a problem with that as long as we can measure the impact that this particular project has. So I'll show you this actually in the pairwise comparison. I have the ability to push in a project based on an opinion where I say, hey, I'm the CEO, this is my pet project, I want this to be pushed through, and you can actually push that through. However, what models like that outline is they actually outline whether this pushing through of a project is actually beneficial to the organization or whether it decreases that beneficiary. Look, and then at the same time, we also need to consider the industry. I always like to refer to that government versus private. Well, I'm very aware that within the government, there are certain promises from a political perspective that have been given. Well, because of those promises, these projects are executed. Does it really require then a prioritization is the $100,000 question. In the past, I've often seen that pet projects have been pushed through, and only afterwards has it been discovered that has not been such a great idea. So yeah, it's an interesting question, and unfortunately, there is no, hey, you do it this way and then it's always right. You have to truly consider that type of industry. So again, from a, what model is right for me, ensure that you understand the balance between effort and benefit, and ensure that you communicate that on all levels. All too often do we see that executive management comes up with a model of them prioritizing, but they do not convey that message to the users that are actually coming up with the business case. I don't necessarily like to always say project managers, because it's not just project managers that come up with business cases. On the contrary, project managers may execute the project, but it is the business that comes up with those kinds of proposals, business cases, ideas, however you wish to call them. Provide the guidance to users, ideally through Clarity. Digital solutions these days, software solutions, actually provide that kind of guidance by explaining when to highlight what, and not only this, the user who creates that kind of dependency or that kind of information, that can actually be overwritten then potentially by a portfolio manager, because they have a different point of view. And again, project prioritization is, when I think about it from a digital perspective and from an impact perspective, is not a short-term endeavor. Prioritization of information and prioritization of projects, really, the impact of that prioritization often will only be felt years after we started that process. So based on experiences that I've had where organizations start to prioritize, it generally takes about 3 years until we have at least that kind of balancing of saying, hey, is that prioritization model actually positively impacting us or not? So please make sure that you test and verify your prioritization model and refine it. It should not be set in stone. It's a very, I always like to call it a very 90s way of saying, oh, but we've always done it this way, and therefore we need to continue doing that. Make sure that you tweak where required. This is where the agility comes into place, and that's really that refining and optimizing prioritization models. All right, so look, what I'll do is I'm going to go through those 3 prioritization models. I will outline them on a high level, and I will actually go into a demo onto the pairwise comparison, just so that you can see what tools you can actually utilize. And hey, Excel is perfectly fine if you want to do a simple prioritization model. Let's have a look at that simple prioritization model. It really is nothing else but outlining areas or projects or ideas, and then setting those priorities, high, medium, lows. There are lots of organizations that can do that simply by checking the project or by looking at the project to determine what that high, medium, low is. As long as you know what high, medium, and low actually constitutes. And that's very important, because a medium project for me may be a high project for someone else. From a user experience, if I would have to go down that endeavor of prioritizing projects, and I've never done that as part of my company or as part of my business, and looking at the journey of organizational maturity, well, this is generally the first step where we say, hey, do we actually have a list of all of our initiatives that we want to execute next year or next term? And if so, do I then have actually a consistent way of marking them or tagging them as a priority? So a simple list is quite often actually very effective and a very first start of that journey, because if you do this for a year or even 2, then you will start to find that the end result is really only showcasing that by accomplishing your strategic goals. That's why that lead period between the selection and between the prioritization and the actual outcome quite often happens a fair chunk after the time. Well, and that's great. That's actually what a lot of organizations do, and it works for them. And as long as it works for you, as long as you see the results, don't change it. Refine it, build it up. But understand the balance between, hey, if I need to spend 3 weeks to get and gather the information for a project that may only last a week, well, then the effort and the benefit, of course, outweigh each other, and we want to make sure that that's not the case. So simple really means tag the information, analyze the information, and approve it accordingly. That being said, over the last, well, I would say over the last 3 years in particular, a scaled agile framework, or SAFe as organizations like to refer to, is actually this, well, I know it's not that new kid on the block anymore, but it outlines the ability for us to react much more agile in the way that we want to prioritize the work. Now, look, it would take me probably, I don't know, 3 weeks to get all over the wonderful world of scaled agile framework. If you are interested in agile and or lean, which really is a combination, SAFe is a combination of agile and lean, and what does that mean from an organizational perspective, I strongly recommend that you go onto the scaledagileFramework.com site, where you can actually see this visualization and can determine how do I as an organization want to actually ensure that I can react quickly to markets. And quite often it starts, of course, on the executive level, on the portfolio level, where where strategic themes determine the type of work that we want to do, our vision, and then really having a, believe it or not, a Kanban approach, just like we have that in Agile as well, where we outline, hey, this is the amount of effort on one hand, but this is the business value. So you will find that that within the SAFe Agile framework, we not only maintain, of course, the effort behind it, but what kind of high value do new feature sets have? And then literally through this coordination, through those epics, we then flow the information down into different departments and, of course, into different teams, where they're then through the receiving of those high-level epics, then have the ability to start breaking that down into sprints and start managing those sprints either on a program or on a project level, so that that pushes itself out. A super interesting concept, especially for service and or product related in organizations, where you literally have the ability to provide that organizational agile capability. That means literally you have the ability to meet on a regular basis, review what we've been doing, so that bottom-up communication in comparison to what comes in from our from our customer feedback, from industry changes, from organizational changes, and really start escalating that down very quickly. So please check that out if you are an Agile company, or if you think about Agile. The Scaled Agile Framework has established itself over the last, well, I'm just going to say 5 years as sort of that leading capability. Now, before I then move on, just opening up for questions very quickly. Now, in your organization, do you actually prioritize in a simple form, and or have you had experience in Scaled Agile Framework? Simon.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm from RMIT, and we're starting down the process of Scaled Agile Framework to understand how it could be applied. And I'm happy to leave this till the end in case you're going to cover it. But I'm interested to get your insights as to how COVID might be changing people's approaches to doing some of this, because I guess in our organisation, I can see some I wouldn't want to say knee-jerk, but I could definitely say urgency and some very direct decisions being made in a similar style to the conversation before about the pet projects, but for a different reason because of the urgency. So I'd be keen to hear either now or later on whether, COVID's changing people's approaches to some of this, if that was okay.
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. Thanks. It's an outstandingly good question, and also a question that has actually been raised before. I will cover that at the end for the Q&A session, but really we see the demand. First of all, what we see, what COVID has changed is the realization that we don't have a process that allows us to optimize our investment, and therefore a need to have that process and consistency implemented into an organization. So that's what we have seen. As much as industries, of course, have suffered a lot from COVID, other industries, and ours actually in particular, suddenly organizations start to realize, hey, actually, I need to have a consistent process. Otherwise, these knee-jerk reactions or these quick decisions are actually hurting us. But I'll come back to that in the Q&A session, Simon. But outstandingly good question, Paul.
Hi, Mark. I was thinking about, so with these models, and I realized that project prioritization is quite political sometimes. How do you really, sell it to decision makers in terms of gaining their trust that this is the way to go, rather than having a set of projects and they try to push, for instance, a pet project outside of the model? How do you really let them trust this model?
That's a great question, Paul. So obviously, project prioritization has been part of our agenda for the last, 12 years, as long as we existed. And often we have to actually do the sales, probably not so much to the executive managers, because they do want to have that capability. But what they often don't realize is actually the effort that it takes in order to introduce that type of consistency. What we've experienced, and that actually goes hand in hand with Simon's comment, organizations realize that themselves. It's that epiphany that I suddenly have. So we definitely have organizations that have always had that need, and I've mentioned, our utility organizations, water utility as well, where they need to do that prioritization in order to receive funds. So therefore, this is a natural thing for them. But really, most organizations start to only realize that when a special event like COVID has actually happened. And then, creating awareness, and trying, actually not just trying, come up with the return on investment when it comes to optimizing your prioritization. We see this all the time. What I refer to the chasm between strategic planning and operational execution. That chasm is actually quite often communication on one hand, and really linking the initiatives that I have, the project programs and portfolios, directly back to the strategy, and that is actually a realization that most organizations do themselves. And the analogy that I like to do is, I love leading the horse to the water, and showcasing the water. Well, I can't dunk in the head and make them drown, right? This is something that they need to do themselves. All right, I am conscious of time. Oh my God, I know that this was a lot of content, but let me go now through this is in my world at least, the most formal way of prioritizing your initiatives against your business drivers or strategic goal. And before I do the demo, I want to outline what it takes to accomplish that kind of prioritization. So this is what we refer to as the pairwise comparison. It's probably the most utilized model worldwide when it comes to project prioritization, at least the most known one. It's based on the analytical hierarchical process, AHP. You can Google that, and there are lots and lots of information sets. But really, what does that mean, project prioritization? Well, as an organization, I need to make sure that I define my strategic goals, of course, improve product quality, expansion into new market, all of the strategic goals that we have, and then, or business drivers as they are sometimes called as well. And then within my executive management team, within my realm, I need to make sure that I as an organization understand, well, when I have those kinds of strategic goals, which ones of those strategic goals form actually the most important part for my strategy going forward. And you will find that executive managers in particular actually have quite often a different view. If you ask a CFO, hey, what's your prioritization against the strategy in comparison to a CEO or any other HR, then you will often find that there are different and competing prioritizations. So there needs to come the time, and we can actually analyze against those different prioritizations components. But as an organization, you need to ensure that you really have a consolidated, agreed prioritization of your strategic goals that generally don't seem to change for a long time, maybe for a year or 2 or 3, depending on how long your strategy is. So in this particular instance, the increased revenue is the most important part, and then expanding into new market segments and improve quality, because that prioritization will also then influence the projects, of course. So that's really that initial setup that we need to have from an executive perspective. What are my strategies, and what are those priorities of those strategies that will ultimately then determine the outcome of my vision? So it gives me really, from an organizational perspective, a clear understanding of what my primary business drivers are. Now, how do I then align that to my initiatives is the big question, right? Well, I've got a project or a business case or an idea, depending on what level you want to have, and you need to then outline certain sets of information. So in my business, for example, I need to create my business case, need to have project information, resources, risks, costs, benefit, and then I need to align those to my business drivers, to my strategic goals, where I can say, hey, this project has an extreme alignment to increase revenue, or has a low alignment to expanding into new market segments. And digital solutions, in my instance, it's actually Project Online, provides you that actually natively out of the box. So let's assume that you have done that not just for one, but for all of the projects that you want to prioritize. I make a point there because there are projects that you don't need to prioritize. Hey, my air conditioning broke. Well, I don't need to do an analysis of ensuring that I'm going to set up a project to fix my air conditioning. So really make sure that you outline what type of projects are important here. Well, and then when you do this to all in a consistent manner to all of the projects, what you then ultimately have is your list of projects, and they can be grouped or aligned by department, by category, by anything that the organization requires in order to have that big picture. And you then compare these alignment of the projects against these driver prioritizations that we've done at the start, and I call it the prioritization magic. It's actually not magic. It's a normal normalization of those priorities, and that then ultimately spits out that list of projects that, in accordance to the calculation, these are the projects that I would do. However, this would be then nirvana land, and let's say I have projects worth, I don't know, $1 billion, but my budget for the year is only $10 million. Well, this prioritization doesn't consider constraints, and this is where that next step follows. So that this initial calculation of, hey, these are my most important projects and these are less important projects, is actually quite straightforward. The difficult part is then setting up those constraints within those projects. So once I've selected those projects, my project B and A and project X, then I need to ensure that I have additional information to manage my constraints and my dependencies. And in the pairwise comparison, we do cost constraints, we do resource constraints, we do dependency management, and we look at time constraints. What exactly does that mean? So I need to understand that if I have a list of all of my projects that are worth $100,000, but I only have an initial budget of $10,000, which one of those projects can I do? So that's why I need to understand what does a project cost me and what are my budget constraints. The second part, of course, is then, well, how many resources do I actually have in place? That could be labor, predominantly labor resources, and where are my bottlenecks if I then approve those types of projects? Do I actually have the workforce to execute that project? Only because I now have an approved list of, of $10 million projects doesn't mean that I have the team to do that. And then, of course, I need to also understand the dependencies. I mentioned that earlier. Low priority projects do not necessarily mean that we kick them out because they form a basis of a higher prioritized projects. Well, and then we need to consider, of course, the time. How long does it take me to implement that project? How many resources do I use? And what can I do in a what-if scenario case to potentially move certain projects to overcome the bottlenecks of resource management or even cost constraints? Only because I haven't selected a project for a particular prioritization component doesn't mean I'm never going to do that. It just means that they may fall into the second prioritization part. Well, once we have accomplished all of those scenarios, then we can run what-if scenarios. So I can say, hey, what happens if I add another 10, if I hire another 10 or another 100 resources? What kind of projects can I do then? Or, hey, what happens if I increase my budget by another $1 million? What kind of scenario can I have? And in the prioritization industry, it's a very American term. Actually, they often say conservative, most likely, and gung-ho. So there are different forms, of course, of modeling, of what-if modeling that you do. Well, once you have done this what-if scenarios, then ultimately executive management or key stakeholders need to agree to it. And only because the model said, hey, I want you to do those lists, doesn't necessarily mean that we do that. We still need to have that human and logic interaction. And once you do that, well, in my scenario, I just simply push a button and I commit those business cases that then automatically become projects that need to be executed. And that's really how this pairwise comparison scenario works. All right, being conscious of time, because I only have 10 more minutes and we still have so much to go through, I will do this very quickly if that's okay. And I want to also point out, if you are interested in that, if you think that this is applicable for your organization, please don't hesitate to contact us. I'm more than happy to give you a much more detailed and in-depth presentation there. So what you see here right now is a tool. It's Microsoft Project Online in this instance, where I can manage my projects and proposals and all of those things, but I do have that strategic driver. So what I've done is we've actually set up our goals, our strategic goals in Microsoft terms, that's called a business drivers. And as you can see, these are now my business drivers. And when I drive into a particular business driver, I can actually already predetermine how I want a project to use that. So expand into new market segments with a description. And then I have the ability as a project manager to either select no, that doesn't have any, this project has no impact, it has a low, a moderate, a strong, or an extreme association to the strategy. The important bit here for me really is measurable. If you cannot measure your strategic goals, then it will be very difficult for the user that comes up with those values to actually associate the project to the right level. So in my opinion, and in industry standards, ensure that you know what those numeric values are. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do. So you set those things up once, when you change your strategy, so every 3-4 years probably, and then you sit down together with your executive team and says, okay, tell me, what kind of prioritization do you see? And as you can see here, I've got a CFO prioritization, a CIO prioritization, I've got a executive consensus. That is generally the one that we then use. We have had workshops where we locked in the executive team into a war room, and we did not let them out until they had consensus. That was a very interesting one. But look, just ultimately what it does is it allows executive managers to come up with a prioritization of their strategy and of their strategic goals. And as you can see right now, we have what we refer to as a consistency ratio. There is actually a tool that allows you to prioritize them, and we always need to make sure that that consistency ratio is high, otherwise we would provide wrong information. So once we've done all of that, that's when we can do the analysis. And I've done a whole bunch of what if analysis here. So the first thing that I do is I ensure that I understand my project dependencies. And these project dependencies are super important because they will determine whether a lower graded project will actually automatically be pushed above the waterline or below. In that instance, does a project have that a mutual dependency, meaning that both have to be implemented? Is there a mutual inclusion or mutual exclusion? So if I have a lower level project and I don't want to do that, then my higher level project would fall out of that model as well. And most of the times actually sort of a finish to start. Hey, I need to do this lower type project in order to accomplish that. This needs to be created before I start my next project. So that's really what I've done here. And then I start those analysis. Here's one I prepared earlier. This is my Q1 IT project portfolio. And look, if I would push that new button, you would get exactly the same screen, just not filled in. In my instance, I've just done that already. So it's just a simple way for me to say, hey, I want to run a scenario. You can do this departmental specific. And look, here are now the executive prioritization. In my instance, I actually used the executive consensus, and then I selected the project that I want to evaluate. Now, in that instance, these may be capital projects. In my instance, it was actually the proposal and selection phase. So only new projects. I don't suggest that you should only ever prioritize new projects. You need to actually have the big picture, incorporate your in-flight projects. I have seen in-flight projects being cancelled even so they were delivered on time, on budget, or under budget, and it worked all well, but they did not accomplish the anticipated strategic outcome, so executives just canned them. Especially in the financial services industry, I actually see that quite often. And then we need to determine how far along do I want to plan. In that instance, as you can see, this is actually a 3-year plan going forward, and I also want to ensure that I manage my roles accordingly, so my resource pool. So once I've done this initial one, I've selected my project, I've outlined my framework that I want to do, I already get a list of all of my projects that I've just selected, and I can see their association onto my strategy. How does that actually happen? Well, let me quickly take my project management hat, my executive management hat off and put my project management hat on. In my project management world, I drive into a project, and this is a project where I can create my business case and my schedule and all of those things, and I can associate in my project now this strategic impact that this particular project will have. As you can see, these are the business drivers, and these are now the different areas of selection. So I can say, hey, my project, I think, has a strong alignment to expanding into new market segment because I will grow the revenue between $1 and $3 million. And that's really how you ensure that that there is that consistency. So once that has happened, the system can actually already pre-prioritize, and it can tell me, hey, my olive twig drone location sensor is actually the highest priority in accordance to what my association to the strategy is. But now I start my constraints, and this is where I literally start my cost constraints. We generally say, okay, hey, if I would do this, sorry, I've already baked this before, of course. If I would do that right now, I have a total budget of $11.85 million. That would mean I would accomplish my strategic value of 100%. That also means I would select 23 projects, and these 23 projects are actually aligned to the initial prioritization from a driver importance, so from an executive, to the selection of all of the projects. So this one here, for example, tells me that, hey, increased market share in existing markets, the suggested projects will not lead up to actually what executive management wants. From here, I now have the ability to do what if scenarios. I can say, hey, what happens if I don't have 11 million, but I only have $8 million? So what I've done is I now changed my budget constraint from 11 to 8, and I say, hey, can you just recalculate that for me? And what it does now, it looks at constraints, at dependencies, at cost, and it says, okay, if you only have $8 million, what that ultimately means is you can only execute 18 projects, which will give you a strategic value of 86%. And these are all of the projects that are, I call them below the waterline here, because these are the selected ones and these are the ones that are moved out. But you know what? My WorldMart networking integration, actually, this is something I really need to do. So therefore, I then have the ability to force in or force out this project. Now, I have organizations that have the explanation, not compliance and strategic initiative, but pet project, which leads us back to the previous conversation, because I can then measure those pet projects. So I'm going to say, hey, this is a compliance project. I need to do that because the government has done that. Then I recalculate this, and as I recalculate, you will then see that it moves that in, but then of course moves the other projects out. So this is really a what if scenario. Look, I've done this now for a few times, and I want to outline. I then save that as a what if scenario, and ultimately I have a whole bunch of what if scenario. In that instance, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 what if scenarios, and I can see straight away under what circumstances, which of the projects have actually been selected. So I know that, hey, no matter what scenario, these are the projects that I can absolutely approve because they just need to happen. And then it is here the compliance one. Yep, this needs to happen because it's a compliance one. So you really have the ability to have that overarching forward-looking view by approving them. Once you then agreed to a particular scenario, really at the end, all you need to do is push this commit button, and that commit button then moves all of those projects into the next stage, and we can actually determine what we want to do, that whether we say we cancel them or we postpone them. And that's really how that project prioritization works. There's one more component, which is the resource analysis. Do I have enough resources? But I'm running out of time. It's already overdue. So I just wanted to outline how the process of how the process is very consistent on one hand, and of course you can optimize that based on the different constraints. By the way, if you don't want to do this against your proposal cost, you can say, hey, do this against my benefit or do this against my return on investment. As long as I have a numerical value that I can compare it with, I can actually do that kind of prioritization. Look, I'm conscious of time. I'm sorry. I know that this was a pretty quick, pretty quick demonstration, but I hope that I conveyed the message over that yes, there is a consistent approach, and yes, it is actually quite a lot of work if you want to do it right. But again, as long as the effort outweighs the benefit, you'll be fine. Now, the second demo was actually a benefit realization demo. I will do this the next time because in my personal opinion, I believe that benefit realization is the ultimate glue between strategy and project execution. But I make sure that we put that onto the agenda for one of the next times. Now, I know I'm already running out of time, I believe. Is that right, Alice? So I'm going to quickly go through some of the submitted questions, and then I'll open up for questioning because I know you guys obviously need to go back to work as well. So first of all, some of the submitted questions: tools and techniques for prioritization, technique for project prioritization. I hope I have given you a glimpse of how you can actually deal with them. Again, consider those kinds of models that are outlined, just a simple model, scaled agile framework, super important for agile organization, or the pairwise comparison. Again, how often do you see organizations stopping or reprioritizing initiative? This seems to be a very difficult thing to do. Yes, it is. I think, as I mentioned earlier, generally, I don't have a lot of organizations that actually prioritize projects, because in order to do that, you need to have a certain amount of project prioritization, project maturity, obviously, and then it is quite often still quite difficult. But for the ones that I have, they generally do it on an annual basis because they need to resubmit their annual budgets. That being said, I've worked with a financial institution, I think I've mentioned it before, that need to very quickly, and that was actually during the global financial crisis, where they had to constantly do that. They did this on a monthly basis, and another organization did it on a quarterly basis. So I would say, as a general guideline, annual is pretty common, but in especially, you know, how will the economic downturn result from COVID affect projects and PPM? You know, that was also Simon's question. Quite clearly, the more impact you have from the outside, the more frequently you need to reprioritize them. Don't be scared of canceling projects that do not have the associated value. In regards to, you know, how does the downturn resulting in COVID? Well, actually, it makes organizations realize that they need to have a process in place, because in today's world, COVID's, financial downturn, these things are just happen way too frequently. We seem to have a catastrophe every 2-3 years that impacts the world. Organizations realize that, and that's why they also want to be able to do that prediction going forward. There was one quick question here that says, hey, should we manage timesheets in tasks within the schedule, or should we have timesheet lines separately to the schedule? This has nothing to do with project prioritization. Just so that I've answered that question too, I will say it depends. If you need timesheet and that timesheet needs to have exactly the same actual value than your schedule, then I would do this based on the task level. If you say, no, look, on a project level is okay, and the project manager updates the task accordingly, well, then just move those timesheet lines on a project level, and then the project manager knows, hey, I've done 20 hours and can update the tasks accordingly. So these were all of the recorded questions. Ken, you had a question? You just need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, Mark. There might have been recently previous webinars. I'm new to the webinars, but really like your product.
Thank you.
In the prioritization, I see that you committed it through there, which was great. We run a 5-year strategic plan.
Yep.
And you have sort of out of the box stuff that will automatically just fit into the a 5-year or whatever you make it strategic plan?
So we do have industry standards configuration already as part of our solution, but really the duration is always dependent on when you create the model. I think I showed you that Horizon model that gives you the ability to do a start and finish date. You just do it there. It does provide that out of the box.
Okay. Thank you.
Pleasure. Look, and with that, I'm sorry I'm 5 minutes over, and I'm sorry, I know I can talk fast. Do you have any questions? Is there any comments, any feedback? Okay, so that must have been either a presentation that was so clear that you don't have questions, which I'm really pleased about. Alternatively, if you have follow-up questions, if you say, well, man, I really need to inhale this first of all, then please do that and send me an email, send us an email. You can always find us, of course, on our websites. Most of you or some of you obviously have my contact details. Please give me a call, send me an email. I'm more than happy to share my experiences. That's my point of being in this beautiful company. And if you just want to submit general questions, please use the let's chat at sensei.cloud. I promise you we will contact you and will respond to your request. With that, I am going to hand over to our lovely Alice again and yeah, finish the workshop for today.
Yep, so everyone, thank you so much for joining. So we've recorded this session and we will certainly share it with you later today. And yeah, as Mark mentioned earlier, if you'd like any follow-ups or if we run out of time to answer your questions today, please feel free to get in touch with any of us and we'll certainly be happy to help you out. And lastly, be sure to check out our events page on the website because we only have 3 more webinars running for the year, so make sure you don't miss out on those.
Well, and with that, I thank you very much for sacrificing your lunch break, and I hope it was worth your while. Thank you.